Yep.
All right, there we are, slide number one. Starting off with this because this quick review of last season that I'm about to do is based on the Shad reports that I wrote. There were 8 of them. A lot of people didn't get number 8. We've had emailing issues, but that's going to change this year. We've changed our emailing software. Hopefully everybody that signed up will get the reports. Of course, some of you in June got them, but didn't read them because your mind was on something totally different than Shad by then. But let's just say that you missed out on a few days of good fishing. But anyway, it's the 16th year of the Shad reports. At least that's how far back I found them on my computer. We try to keep it fun in these reports and cover the full experience of springtime on the river. And, encourage people to sign up on our website through the Shad tab. And also send me photos and stories about your catches this spring, because that's what I depend on. I do work at the boathouse every weekday afternoon, so you can also find me there. Next slide, Ben. Last season, guess who gets the first hickory shad of the year? It was March 12th. Water temperatures in the low 50s. After me, John will get go further into the river data. But this is a funny story only because Alex was busy setting up the boathouse, watched one guy after another walk out to shore to fish, worried each time they'd come back or send him a text with a picture. Nobody caught anything. And so he goes out when he has a minute in a boat, catches the first shad of the year on his first cast. Unbelievable. Next slide. Chris Campo followed up that with the first American shad, also from shore, of course, because the boats weren't out yet. And that was on March 15th. Next. Now, and by the way, those catches were a few days later than previous years, but to me, it's still unreal to be catching American shad on March 15th. Shad are striking much earlier than they did when I was a kid. On the week of March 22nd, things really got hot, and Kuriawa and his friend Phil Kirshner had huge catches from kayaks. Also Terry Cummins, who tied a fly for us last year and works out in Leesburg, Orvis. So if it's anything like last year, this year, you can expect that last week of March to be great if the river is in good shape. Next, that shad before was one of Phil's nice shad. And here's one from Fong from shore at Gordon's Rock. That's Gordon's Rock to the left there. And that's a great place to stand and catch shad. Now, this slide shows that the river was low. It was low most of the season, except for a few pushes of water. But when it's low, it's clear. And I think that's a great picture to show that. It can be a challenge to fish Gordon's when it's low if you don't have boots or hip waders, at least at low tide. Next slide. By the first week of April on up to the 9th or 10th, the American shad started really hitting well. And of course, hickories continued. Jim Stables reported over 100 shad in his kayak. This is Sandy Burke with a nice one in a boat. When you think about it, the boat's only been out for a week or a little bit more. By that point, we're already catching nice roe American shad. Next. And then in that same time period, Andy Spence's son Grady caught this, and Andy was our chapter president, probably back in the early 2000s, but in any case, he did a lot of work for the chapter, especially our annual show, and we haven't seen as much of him with his young, his kids so young, but we're going to see more, I have a feeling, especially if Grady gets shad fever. Next, speaking of little kids, I was training my new granddaughter to enjoy John McPhee's great book, The Founding Fish. The reason I showed this in the Shad Report was, well, I wanted to show off my granddaughter, but there was a section in the book about shad with having emotional problems. It's the colorful description that biologist Boyd Kynard explained to McPhee for this, terrifying trip shad take up the rivers. They're very fearful during the run. They're afraid of variation, afraid of the unknown. And during this period of mid-April, there was a little bit of some turbidity, and nothing too terrible, but fishing was down for a while, and it just got me thinking about, with all of the other things they're fearful of on their journey, when the rivers go up and down and get muddy and get clear, it must be quite a challenge for them. Next slide. Lois, things started picking up again towards the end of April, and on April 29th, Lois caught this nice American shad roe. She's become known as the shad queen, and she's not just a regular Fletcher. She fishes every day, and this is great for me because she keeps me posted on what's going on, especially up at Gordon's Rock. And there are others as well that do that, and I encourage all of you to stay in touch with me. Next. And that same period of time, late April, Chris Wood took out Chuck Dinkle. Chuck has been with TU forever and has worked for Trout in the Classrooms, with formerly with the late Jim Green. He's still active doing it. He publishes books helpful to kids, and they had a great trip. Chuck would send an email later saying that he caught 10 to 12 American shad, over 15 hickory shad, 1 smallmouth bass, and also he included hooking Chris Wood. That was, I thought that was pretty funny. Maybe Chris didn't, but I was nearby them that day, and it's just a great fun fishing for shad in groups out on the river. And we were all fly fishing, so you can do it close to each other. Next. Chris got a great shot, by the way. I don't know if it was that day or another day. Chris is becoming an almost everyday guy too, but he got a great shot in the clear water of this American shad as he landed, right before he landed it. Next. Then on May 1st, May Day, extremely low river at low tide due to the low flow and the north wind driving all the water out. And Alex calls this condition non-tidal, which is really fascinating because the river actually starts flowing back. I mean, the river is the cove is lower than the river. Let's just put it that way. And when this happens, the boats can't get out. So this is what FFC is working on. And there were a few days affected last year, and there are going to be more unless something happens. And maybe a flood will actually help things next time. But Next slide. And then around this time, in fact, during that extremely low condition, Alex took out a writer from The Economist magazine, and we Fletcher's got some publicity in a international magazine. The author is James Astle, and he writes the Lexington column and comes down in the spring as often as he can to shad fish with his 3 sons. So that was a great column, and I hope everybody got a chance to see it, or I hope you can get it online now for free. Next slide. Another one from early May. That the shad one was pretty good, in early May. Once we got some water because it had been almost too low. But I just show this slide partly because Chris is a former boathouse employee. He works with DOEE now in the fisheries and wildlife and fisheries division. But he'll come down after work, and more and more our young employees at the boathouse are taking up to fishing. So that's great. And they'd get out there in the evening, and I'd have to stand there watching them catch these American shad, and I couldn't do a thing about it. Next slide. So started to get hot, and on May 18th, a man I met, Andy Sohn, took this shot downriver. I don't know if it's coming through, but there's a dot, not that rock in the closer, but way down. That turned out to be me fishing, and I didn't do very well. So I rode up river, and then I encountered Andy up at Pothole Rock, and I rode further up from that. I was actually striper fishing at that point, but Andy had caught 1 American shad and 1 hickory shad in those somewhat miserable conditions where the water had gotten a little warm and we couldn't find shad. But it made sense to go upriver in that situation. That's what he did. Gordon's Rock had no flow whatsoever. But really, I thought the run was over by about May 18th. I think Fred Michaud had 2 Americans that day also that his 2, and then Andy's fish were the only ones I had heard of. I thought that was it. Next slide. But really, about 2 weeks later, on Memorial Day weekend, there was a big temperature drop, and it was miserable weather, and I don't think anybody fished. Water temperatures were scary low, but by Memorial Day itself, they were starting to rise, and they were around 65 degrees. And I was striper fishing when I took this picture. Striper fishing was outstanding. Fly rod striper fishing. All right, next slide. Down below me, Lois Bolin, I've talked about her. She took this impressive American shad on her striper jig. All right, next slide. The next day, I did the same thing on a clouser, and so the next day would be on the 2nd of June, on Wednesday, and I decided, I just pulled up and went down to a nice shad area above Walker's Point, and switched to shad fishing and forget the stripers. And when you know it, there was a big school of fish down there. So that day, I got 3 bucks and 4 rows, and that's pretty good for June. Anything's good for June. These fish were spawning in a hurry. The next day, I caught a few more, and Mike Bailey and others joined me down there. We caught a few more. Then by Friday, it was just 1 spawned out buck, and they were spawning fast. The river was rising, and temperature fast as the weather returned to normal. And it occurred to me later that I hadn't switched lines back over from my striper line. I used interchangeable shooting heads, and I had kept my T14 head on, which is 420 grains. So this corresponds to something Ryan was saying, using heavier lines. And I think it had a lot to do with why I took those fish in June. I think they're deeper later. So next slide. The Shad Report also features the unusual and the bizarre. This was in the unusual category. That I think everybody probably saw this picture of a sturgeon caught by Connor Lynch on April 16th after a minor push of high water. He and Josh Cohn were striper fishing when this happened. It was all over social media and Channel 9 News, and it was said to indicate the health of the river, itself improving. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to turn this over. Yeah, I'm turning this over to John. That's John in his canoe. I think we'll see him more in a rowboat again this year. But we're going to turn it over to John to go over some fascinating data that he collected for last season.
Thank you, Mark. And I think some of the USGS gauges will encapsulate and summarize what you've discussed. Mark and I were talking about the reports for last year, and I realized quickly that from early March or mid-March when we started fishing to almost early June, the temperature range and the flow that I was catching fish at was really similar. So what you see here is a static graph that you can download from the USGS site. And this one starts at the first date that Alex caught that hickory, and it ends at the last date that Mark caught an American shad on June 4th, actually. And the orange line in the middle is a sort of a pseudo regression line. It sort of demonstrates what the average was over that time. And you'll note that the green boundaries are pointing out the ideal temperatures for catching American hickory shad, from about the low 50s, 52, to about the low 70s. And you can see on this chart the amount of days that were in that range and around that range. And as we move forward, Ben, you can go to the next one. You'll see that for the entire season last year, there were only about 5 days that were unfishable due to flow. And that was that April pulse when we had a rainstorm. That's very unusual. Normally there's 2 or 3 situations in which the river is unfishable due to high water and Alex is unable to rent boats. So it was sort of a glorious season in terms of, if you had a chance to get down there, of these 85 days I'm showing you, probably 75 or 80 were good fishing days. Now, I'm not accounting for wind or rain or horrible tides, but if you look at this graph, gauge height of 4 is awesome. And we had it for the majority of the season. Next slide, Ben. So this is the last one. This is the turbidity. And last year I discussed that anything less than 10 is really ideal, and the shad can see your lures, and you ought to be able to catch them. And I did a quick count. There's 10 or 11 days here where the turbidity was actually sort of out of range. But you'll note that half of those days were the large pulse of water that occurred from about April 12th through about the 17th. Now, I can tell you, I was actually fishing on the 18th. And while the water was still falling and it was very turbid, we did very well. We caught a lot of hickories that day. It was actually a gorgeous weekend day. There were a lot of people out. So the sort of takeaway from these 3 quick slides is that maybe you shouldn't expect such a wonderful season this year, and you might have some downtime. But last season presented lots of opportunities to get out. And so I had indicated in my presentation last year that studying these things is important. And it led to get down to the river. There were lots of chances to be out, whether it was morning or late. So hopefully, you could take away from this that, when you look at these charts, if the temperature is between 55 and 65, if the gauge height's between 3.5 and 4.5, and the turbidity is below 10, get down there and try to catch the shad. Thanks, Ben.
Great. Thanks so much, John. And just advancing to the next slide, we have some emails. John and Mark have very kindly offered their emails too, if you want to reach out directly with some additional questions. But Mark, I might turn it over to you to introduce Jim.
Okay. Boy, this is a last minute addition. I was so happy that Jim offered to do this. We don't have a lot of time, but he's going to give us an update on shad abundance with the latest data that he collects. Now, Jim is retired from the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin, and he is the guy, most responsible for the restoration of American shad in the Potomac, and he's helped out on other rivers as well. I think he may still be volunteering elsewhere, even tributaries of the Delaware. He might have time to say more about that. But you all know Jim. He's helped out at many of our shad nights. So here he is.
Thanks, Mark. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, I'll just give you an update on how many shad we are in the river. The first slide, if you look at the bottom left-hand side, you'll see the number of shad collected from the mid-40s to the mid-50s. That dark blue line running along that is the average of those, or the mean of those. And that became the restoration target set by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. If you look at the middle of the chart, you see the Potomac River Fisheries Commission data from the late 70s until the early 80s. Again, it was closed in 82. And you see how much lower the numbers were during that period. And then over to the right, you're going to see the catch per unit effort of the bycatch, the pound nets. This is data from the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. And they started collecting that data in 1999. But I point out that the trend that bounces around a little bit, the trend is going uphill really well. That green line is the mean of all of that data set from 1999 until 2021. And that green line's well above that restoration target. It's been above that target since 2012. And that's again a mean of a 20-some year period. We've been trying to get the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to go with a 10-year running mean, which would have put that line even higher. But from this is the most important data, because this is what establishes what is allowed to be caught in the Potomac. Next slide, please. So it has a legal threshold. Next slide, please. Can you hear me all right? Yeah, okay. The next bit of data is equally important, and this is information that's collected by Maryland Department of Natural Resources when they do their springtime. Oops, go back a slide, sorry. When they do their striped bass survey, and fortunately, they also count the number of shad they've collected. They started this collection in '96, and you've got it up until 2021, and you see the general trend there. While it bounces around a little bit, it's still an upward trend. And backing up a little bit, in 2020, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission said from their data, the Potomac shad population didn't look like it was sustainable. I think the fish are saying something a little bit different. And the final slide for my 5 minutes here is the Young of the Year survey. Maryland Department of Natural Resources, again, has been doing a bay-wide survey of, Hall Seine survey through a variety of sites in the Chesapeake Bay, 2 of them in the Potomac. And so we've got data from that from 1959 for the Potomac. And you see below it was from 1959, the far left, until about 1994. And that's when we started the stocking program. And then everything to the right of that is sort of after the stocking program and the removal of, or the modification of, the Brookmont Dam, which also helped to boost the numbers a lot. And again, you see it bouncing around a little bit, as these numbers will. Some of that's not just the numbers, but the ability to get out and monitoring the weather. Like the last couple of years have been kind of tough because of COVID, and some of the DNR staff have a harder time, getting staff out in the last couple of years. But there's still, the last 20 years have been more than the previous record. And I started stocking program in '94, I look back at going, oh, I'd like to get up to those numbers of the 1970s. Well, for, again, for 20 plus years, we've been well above that. And the general trends, the trajectory is going up. And we'll wait and see what it is this year, but they're doing pretty well. I don't trust the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's report and their own data. The peer review of their data said you shouldn't use that data for management purposes. So that's basically what I wanted to present you with. It looks like they're doing well. It's a little bit of a lower last year than the other years, but compared to the 70s, and that's when Joe Fletcher and others were fishing on these previous slides where, those really low numbers. So people haven't seen this many shad in lifetimes. So it's really good. And I'm really happy to hear your reports. And you're going to get a talk by Bill Gordon. And I was lucky to meet him up on the Brandywine Creek of the Delaware River this past spring. And he's just an amazing fisherman. So I'm looking forward to his presentation as well. And that pretty much ends what I was going to talk about. I'd entertain questions if anybody has any.